The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1878, and Josephine Fletcher would later remember thinking how strange it was that a single piece of paper could change everything about a person's life. She stood in the dusty parlor of Mrs. Hargrove's Boston boarding house, her fingers trembling as she read the contract for the third time, searching for words that surely must be hidden somewhere in the fine print. Words like wife or marriage or bride, but finding only cold legal terms like domestic service, household duties, and term of employment not to exceed 5 years. Mrs. Hargrove cleared her throat from the doorway, her plump face arranged in an expression that might have been sympathy if Josephine hadn't known better. "It's a fine opportunity, dear. Many girls would be grateful for such a position out west, room and board and a small wage besides." "But the advertisement said," Josephine began, her voice catching. She pulled the crumpled newspaper clipping from her pocket, the one that had seemed like Providence itself just 2 weeks ago. It said gentlemen seeking wives, respectable arrangement, passage paid. "And I'm sure it's all quite respectable," Mrs. Hargrove said firmly. "You'll be working in a proper household. Mr. Thornton, who arranged this, is a respected businessman. He wouldn't steer us wrong." Josephine looked down at the contract again, at the signature line waiting for her mark, at the date that would bind her for 5 years to a man whose name she didn't even know, in a place called Abilene, Texas, that might as well be on the moon for all she knew of it. Behind her, through the thin walls, she could hear the other girls moving about, girls with families and prospects, girls who had somewhere to go when the boarding house lease ran out at the end of the month. She had nowhere. No family since the fever took her parents 3 years ago, no inheritance except debts, no skills except reading and sums and needlework that thousands of other Boston girls could do just as well. The factory work had dried up, and the respectable positions all required references she didn't have. Her hand moved almost of its own accord, picking up the pen, dipping it in ink. The signature looked small and lost at the bottom of the page, but it was done. 3 weeks later, she stepped off the train in Abilene with a carpet bag containing everything she owned and dust already settling into the folds of her dark green traveling dress. The town sprawled before her in the late afternoon heat, a collection of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up in a hurry and might blow away just as fast. The air smelled of cattle and horses and something else she couldn't name, something wild and open that made her lungs expand despite her anxiety. A man in a brown suit approached her, consulting a paper in his hand. "Miss Fletcher?" "Yes, sir. I'm Thornton. We'll get you settled at the ranch." "It's about an hour's ride." She followed him to a wagon, noticing how he didn't offer to help with her bag, didn't make small talk, just snapped the reins once she was seated and started them moving out of town. The landscape rolled past, endless and brown, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional twisted tree. Mountains rose in the far distance, purple shadows against the sky. "The household you'll be serving," Thornton said after 20 minutes of silence, "belongs to the Garrett family. Cattle ranchers, quite prosperous. You'll answer to Mrs. Garrett primarily, though of course you'll serve the whole family as needed, cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, standard domestic work." "How many in the family?" Josephine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Garrett, her son, and usually a few ranch hands take meals at the house. You'll have a room off the kitchen. Sundays you may have the afternoon free if your work is done." 5 years, Josephine thought. 5 years of this, and then what? She'd be 25, still alone, with a few dollars saved if she was lucky and nowhere to go. But she'd signed the contract. She'd taken the train fare. There was no going back now. The ranch house appeared as they crested a low rise, a sprawling wooden structure with a wide porch and several outbuildings scattered around it. Cattle moved in distant pens, and she could see figures on horseback working among them. Thornton pulled up to the house and finally helped her down, more out of formality than courtesy. A woman emerged onto the porch, tall and thin with gray hair pulled back severely, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "So this is the girl," she said, not as a question. "Yes, madam, Miss Josephine Fletcher, as contracted." Mrs. Garrett looked Josephine up and down with cold assessment. "She's scrawny. Can she work?" "I can work, madam," Josephine said, lifting her chin. "I'm stronger than I look. We'll see. Bring your things, Thornton, you'll stay for supper." "No, madam. I need to get back to town before dark." Josephine watched her last connection to civilization climb back into the wagon and drive away, leaving her standing in the dust with her carpetbag and a growing sense that she'd made a terrible mistake. Mrs. Garrett had already turned and walked back into the house, clearly expecting to be followed. The kitchen was large and surprisingly well appointed, with a cast iron stove, a pump at the sink, and shelves lined with dishes and provisions. A wooden table dominated the center, scarred from years of use. Mrs. Garrett pointed to a door in the corner. "That's your room. Put your things away and come back. Supper needs to be started." The room was barely larger than a closet, with space for a narrow bed, a small dresser, and nothing else. No window. Josephine set her bag on the bed and stood for a moment, fighting the burning in her eyes. She would not cry. She had survived worse than this. She could survive 5 years. When she returned to the kitchen, Mrs. Garrett was laying out vegetables on the table. "Can you cook?" "Yes, madam. Plain cooking, nothing fancy." "Plain is what we need. There'll be 4 for supper, myself, my son Lucas, and 2 of the hands. Lucas likes his meat rare and his coffee strong. The hands will eat anything. I expect meals on time, the kitchen kept clean, and no waste. You'll do the washing on Mondays and Thursdays, mending when there's time. I'll show you the rest tomorrow. For now, get this stew started." Josephine worked steadily, grateful to have something to occupy her hands, following Mrs. Garrett's terse instructions. The older woman watched her like a hawk for the first hour, then seemed satisfied enough to retreat to other parts of the house. Alone, Josephine let herself breathe, falling into the familiar rhythm of slicing and stirring, building the fire to the right heat, measuring coffee into the pot. She heard them coming before she saw them, the sound of boots on the porch, men's voices, the creak of the door. Mrs. Garrett returned to the kitchen, and moments later, 3 men filed in. The ranch hands went straight to the basin to wash up, but the 3rd man stopped just inside the doorway, and Josephine found herself staring. He was tall, probably 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. Dust covered his clothes and his face was sunburned, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a kind of quiet strength that made the room feel smaller. He looked at her with surprise, then at his mother with what might have been anger. "Who's this?" "The new girl. Josephine Fletcher. She'll be doing the household work from now on. I didn't know we were hiring." "I handle the household, Lucas. You handle the cattle." His jaw tightened and he looked at Josephine again, something unreadable in his expression. "Where's she from?" "Boston," Josephine said before Mrs. Garrett could answer. "Sir, Boston." He said it like it was another country. "That's a long way to come for kitchen work. Lucas, wash up, supper's ready." He held Josephine's gaze for another moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, concern or maybe recognition, as if he understood something she hadn't said. Then he turned away and joined the hands at the basin. Supper was an awkward affair. Josephine served the food, poured coffee, and tried to be invisible the way she imagined servants were supposed to be. The ranch hands, a grizzled older man named Pete and a younger one called Sam, ate in focused silence. Mrs. Garrett picked at her food and made occasional comments about ranch business. Lucas said almost nothing, but Josephine felt his eyes on her more than once when she moved around the table. After the meal, while she was clearing plates, he finally spoke to her directly. "How long is your contract?" She nearly dropped the dishes she was holding. 5 years, sir." 5 years, he repeated, his voice flat, "for kitchen work." "Lucas, that's enough," his mother said sharply. "Did you sign it willingly?" "I signed it." Josephine kept her eyes down, feeling heat rise to her face. "I needed the position." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll be in the barn." The door slammed behind him and Mrs. Garrett sighed with irritation. "Don't mind him. He gets notions. Finish clearing up, then you can retire. We rise at 5. Josephine worked until the kitchen was spotless, until her back ached and her hands were raw from the harsh soap. In her tiny room, she changed into her nightgown and lay on the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night. Somewhere, cattle lowed. Horses moved in their stalls. The wind whispered around the corners of the house. She thought about Lucas Garrett's eyes, about the anger she'd seen there that didn't seem directed at her, but at the situation itself. She thought about 5 years stretching ahead of her like an endless road, and she finally let herself cry quietly into the thin pillow. The days fell into a punishing routine. Up before dawn to start the fire and put coffee on, then breakfast for whoever was around. After that, an endless cycle of cleaning, washing, mending, preparing the next meal. Mrs. Garrett was exacting and cold, praising nothing and criticizing everything. The ranch hands were polite but distant, treating her like part of the furniture. Lucas was different. He didn't talk much, but he looked at her in a way that made her feel seen, not just as a servant but as a person. He started coming in earlier for breakfast, sitting at the table while she cooked, nursing his coffee in silence. Sometimes he'd ask her questions. Where in Boston had she lived? Did she have family? How had she ended up here? She answered carefully at first, aware of Mrs. Garrett's disapproving presence, but gradually she relaxed. He seemed genuinely interested, and there was a kindness in him that his mother entirely lacked. 2 weeks after her arrival, she was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard raised voices from the house. She tried not to listen, but sound carried in the dry air. "It's not right, Mother. You told me we were hiring help, not buying an indentured servant. Don't be dramatic." The girl signed a contract freely. Did she? Or did Thornton deceive her like he deceived the others? That's no concern of yours. It is my concern. This is my ranch too. Your father's ranch, which will be yours someday, but not yet. I manage the household as I see fit. The argument continued, but Josephine forced herself to focus on the laundry, pinning sheets to the line with shaking hands. So there had been others. Other girls brought out under false pretenses, trapped by contracts they couldn't break. She wondered what had happened to them, why she hadn't seen any sign of them. That evening, Lucas came into the kitchen after supper while she was washing dishes. His mother had already retired and the house was quiet. "Miss Fletcher," he said. "Josephine, may I speak with you?" She dried her hands on her apron, nervous. "Of course, sir. Please don't call me sir. My name is Lucas." He leaned against the table, looking uncomfortable. "I want to apologize. I didn't know about the circumstances of your contract. If I had, I would have stopped it. It's not your fault. I signed it. Under false pretenses, I'm guessing. You thought you were coming out here to marry someone, didn't you?" The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Thornton has done this before," Lucas said, anger tightening his features. He finds desperate women back east and promises them one thing while writing another in the contract. By the time they figure it out, they're stuck here with no money to get home. My mother knows, and she doesn't care. She thinks she's getting loyal servants who can't leave. What happened to the others? Josephine asked quietly. Most served out their contracts and left. A few married local men and stayed. One just disappeared in the night and we never found out where she went. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I wish I could just tear up your contract and send you home, but legally, you'd still owe Thornton for the travel expenses and my mother for room and board. You'd leave with less than you came with. Then there's nothing to be done. She tried to keep the despair out of her voice. Maybe there is. He looked at her intently. Give me some time to think. There might be a way out of this that doesn't leave you destitute. Will you trust me? She searched his face, looking for deception, but found only earnest concern. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Because it's wrong, he said simply. And because I've seen what this place does to people trapped here against their will. You don't deserve that. Over the following days, something shifted between them. Lucas found reasons to be around the house more, helping her carry heavy pots, fixing a loose board in her room, bringing in extra firewood so she wouldn't have to. They talked during these moments, real conversations that made Josephine feel human again. He told her about the ranch, about growing up in Texas, about his father who died 5 years ago and left him trying to manage both the cattle operation and his increasingly bitter mother. She told him about Boston, about losing her parents, about the loneliness of being utterly alone in the world. She made him laugh with stories about the boarding house, about Mrs. Hargrove's terrible cooking and the ancient cat that terrorized everyone. When she laughed at his stories in return, she saw something warm in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. Mrs. Garrett noticed, of course. She started finding more tasks to keep Josephine busy, interrupting whenever she found them talking, making pointed comments about servants knowing their place. The tension in the house grew thick as the autumn days shortened. One afternoon in late October, Josephine was in the pantry taking inventory when she heard the front door slam and Mrs. Garrett's voice, shrill with anger. "How dare you? That's a legal contract." "It's an immoral contract based on deception, and you know it," Lucas's voice replied, cold and hard. Josephine crept to the pantry door, her heart pounding. Through the crack, she could see them in the parlor, facing each other like duelists. "She owes 3 more years of service," Mrs. Garrett said. "She owes nothing. Thornton lied to her. The contract is void. No court would agree with you." "Then we won't involve a court." Lucas pulled something from his pocket, and Josephine recognized the papers of her contract. "I'm handling this my way." "Lucas, don't you dare!" He walked to the fireplace and threw the papers into the flames. They caught immediately, curling and blackening, the words that had bound Josephine disappearing into ash and smoke. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Garrett's face had gone white, then red. "You fool," she whispered. "You don't understand what you've done." "I understand perfectly." "Josephine is free to go or free to stay as she chooses, but not as a servant. If she stays, it'll be as my wife." Josephine's gasp was audible in the quiet. Both of them turned to see her standing in the pantry doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. "Josephine," Lucas said, his voice gentler now. He crossed the room to her, leaving his mother standing frozen by the fireplace. "I'm sorry. This isn't how I wanted to do this. I was going to talk to you first, but she found out what I was planning." "Your wife," Josephine managed to say, "if you'll have me." He reached for her hand and she let him take it, too shocked to pull away. "I know it's sudden. I know you barely know me, but these past weeks talking with you, getting to know you, I've felt something I haven't felt in years. Hope, maybe. Happiness. The ranch feels different when you're here." "I feel different." "You're only doing this to save me from the contract," she said, even as her heart was racing. "I'm doing this because I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly. "The contract just made me realize I couldn't let you go. I couldn't stand by and watch you trapped here, miserable, counting down 5 years until you could leave. But I also couldn't stand the thought of you leaving at all. So yes, I burned the contract. And now I'm asking you to stay anyway, not as a servant, but as my wife, as my partner, as someone I choose and who chooses me back." Behind him, Mrs. Garrett made a sound of pure fury. "This is absurd. She's a nobody from Boston. She has nothing." "She has herself," Lucas said without turning around. "That's enough for me. Mother, you can accept this or not, but it's happening either way. This is my decision." Josephine looked at him, at his honest face and his steady eyes, at the hand holding hers like she was something precious. She thought about the contract burning in the fireplace, about 5 years of servitude turned to ash. She thought about these past weeks, about conversations in the kitchen and the way her heart lifted every time he walked into a room. It was mad. It was impossible. She'd known him less than 2 months, but she'd come west looking for something, hadn't she? A new life, a chance, someone to build a future with. She'd been deceived about how she'd find it, but maybe, impossibly, she'd found it anyway. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." His smile was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in a way that felt safe and right and like coming home to a place she'd never been. "This isn't over," Mrs. Garrett said coldly. "You'll regret this, Lucas." "The only thing I regret is not figuring this out sooner." He kept one arm around Josephine, facing his mother with his chin up. "We'll be married as soon as possible. You're welcome to stay on here as long as you treat Josephine with the respect she deserves as my wife. If you can't do that, I'll help you find somewhere else to live." The older woman's face worked through several emotions before settling on icy composure. "I'll be in my room. Don't expect me at supper." After she left, Josephine sagged against Lucas, suddenly trembling. Did that really just happen? It really did. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gentle against her cheeks. "Are you all right? I know I pushed you into this. If you need time, I don't need time," she interrupted. "I need you to tell me this is real, that you mean it. It's real." "I mean it. Every word." He hesitated, then asked, "May I kiss you?" She nodded, and he leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. When his lips met hers, soft and sweet and careful, she felt something inside her chest bloom like a flower opening to the sun. This was what she'd been looking for. This was the life that had been waiting on the other side of that terrible contract. They were married 3 days later in the small church in Abilene, with Pete and Sam as witnesses, and a handful of curious townspeople filling the pews. Mrs. Garrett stayed at the ranch, making her disapproval clear through absence. The preacher, an elderly man named Reverend Walsh, seemed confused by the rushed nature of the wedding but performed the ceremony anyway, his voice creaking through the familiar words. Josephine wore her best dress, the dark blue one she'd saved for special occasions, with a few wildflowers that Lucas had picked that morning pinned in her hair. He wore a clean shirt and a new vest, his hair finally trimmed, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. When he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his hands were shaking. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Walsh said. "You may kiss your bride." Lucas pulled her close and kissed her in front of everyone, and Josephine felt her cheeks burn even as she kissed him back. The few people watching clapped politely, and then it was done. She was Josephine Garrett now, a rancher's wife, as far from a servant as it was possible to be. The next few weeks were a strange adjustment. Mrs. Garrett remained coldly formal, speaking only when necessary and spending most of her time in her room or visiting neighbors. Lucas moved Josephine's few belongings into his room, the master bedroom with its large bed and actual windows that looked out over the rolling ranch land. At night, lying beside him in the darkness, learning the contours of marriage, both physical and emotional, she sometimes couldn't believe this was her life now. He was gentle with her, patient as she learned what it meant to be a wife in all the ways that mattered. Their first night together, he'd held her close and whispered, "We'll go as slow as you need. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world." But she found she didn't want to go slow. She wanted everything this new life offered, wanted to seal this unexpected marriage with more than just words and paper. So she kissed him and pulled him closer, and he made love to her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. In the daylight hours, she slowly transformed from servant to mistress of the house. Lucas insisted she hire a girl from town to help with the heavy work, a cheerful 16-year-old named Mary who chattered constantly and seemed delighted to have employment. This freed Josephine to learn about the ranch itself, to ride out with Lucas and see the cattle operation, to understand the business that was now partly hers. She'd never ridden a horse before coming to Texas, but Lucas taught her patiently, walking beside her at first, then letting her trot, then finally gallop across the open range with the wind in her hair and a sense of freedom she'd never imagined. On horseback, the ranch seemed less like a prison and more like a kingdom, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. 2 months after the wedding in mid-December, Mrs. Garrett finally broke her cold silence. She appeared at breakfast one morning and announced she was moving to live with her sister in San Antonio. "I can't stay here and watch you make a mockery of this family," she told Lucas, her voice bitter. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mother. You chose a stranger over your own blood." "I chose my wife," Lucas said firmly. "And I chose happiness. I wish you could be happy for me, but if you can't, then maybe this is for the best." She left the following week, taking several trunks and the buggy and most of the household silver. Lucas let her go without argument, and after she was gone, the ranch house felt lighter somehow, easier to breathe in. "Do you miss her?" Josephine asked that night, curled against his side in their bed. "I miss who she used to be," he admitted. "Before my father died, she was different, warmer. But grief changed her, made her hard. She couldn't let go of the past, and it poisoned her." He kissed the top of Josephine's head. "I won't make that mistake. I'm holding on to the present, and you're in it." Winter settled over the ranch, cold and clear. There was still work to be done, cattle to be fed and checked, fences to be mended, but the pace was slower than the frantic activity of fall. Lucas taught Josephine to shoot, setting up targets behind the barn and standing behind her to adjust her stance, his arms around her as she aimed and fired. She was a terrible shot at first, but she improved, and she loved these moments when they were alone together, working as partners. They talked for hours during the long winter evenings, sitting by the fire while the wind howled outside. He told her about his dreams for the ranch, about expanding the herd, about maybe raising horses as well as cattle. She told him about the books she'd read as a girl, about wanting to see more of the world, about wondering if they might someday travel back east so she could show him where she'd come from. "We could," he said. "Maybe next year after the spring cattle drive. I'd like to see Boston through your eyes." She also began to understand the community she'd married into. Neighboring ranchers stopped by to meet the new Mrs. Garrett, their wives inviting her to church socials and quilting bees. Some were curious, some were kind, and a few were coldly judgmental, having heard rumors about the circumstances of her arrival. Josephine held her head high and won them over slowly, proving through her actions and her obvious devotion to Lucas that she was no fortune hunter or schemer. The women who became her true friends were other transplants. Sarah Jenkins, who'd come from St. Louis to marry a rancher and still sometimes got teary-eyed about the lack of theater and concerts. Margaret Sullivan, a doctor's widow who'd chosen to stay in Texas after her husband's death, and now ran a boarding house in town. And Emma Rodriguez, whose Mexican mother and Irish father had given her a unique perspective on belonging nowhere and everywhere at once. They took Josephine under their collective wing, teaching her the unwritten rules of ranch society, sharing recipes and gossip and genuine affection. On a January afternoon, sitting in Sarah's parlor with tea and cake, Josephine realized she was happy in a way she hadn't been since before her parents died. She had a home. She had friends. She had a husband she was genuinely falling more in love with every day. "You look like the cat that got the cream," Emma said, grinning at her. Josephine blushed. "I was just thinking how lucky I am." "Lucky nothing," Margaret said briskly. "You survived a terrible situation and made the best of it. That's not luck, that's strength." "I think it's love," Sarah said, her voice soft and romantic. "The way Lucas looks at you, Josephine, like you hung the moon and stars. That's not something you can force or fake. Whatever brought you here, you two were meant to find each other." That night, Josephine repeated Sarah's words to Lucas as they lay in bed. "Do you think that's true? That we were meant to find each other?" He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "I don't know about meant. I think life is mostly chaos and chance. But I think we chose each other, and that's better than fate. You chose to say yes when you could have said no. I chose to burn that damn contract instead of looking the other way. We keep choosing each other every day. That's what matters." "I choose you," she whispered, turning to kiss him. "Today and tomorrow and every day after." "And I choose you, Josephine Garrett. Always." Spring came slowly to the Texas plains, the brown grass greening up, wildflowers exploding across the hillsides in riots of color. The ranch work picked up again, preparations for the spring cattle drive consuming most of Lucas's attention. He'd be gone for nearly 2 months, riding north with the herd to the railhead in Kansas, and the thought of being separated left Josephine feeling anxious. "I wish I could come with you," she said one evening in late March, watching him check his gear. "Next year, maybe, if you really want to. But the trail is hard, Josephine. Dust and heat and danger from rustlers and weather. I'd spend the whole time worrying about you instead of watching the cattle. I know. I just hate the idea of you being gone so long." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I'll miss you every minute, but Pete will be here with some of the other hands to watch the ranch. You'll be safe. And when I get back, we'll have the money to expand the herd, maybe build that new barn we talked about. It's for our future." She helped him pack, tucking in extra socks and the scarf she'd knitted during the winter. The morning he left, she woke before dawn to make breakfast for the whole crew, feeding the dozen men who would drive nearly 1,000 head of cattle north across the plains. Lucas kissed her goodbye on the porch while the others were mounting up, a long, deep kiss that promised a reunion. "Come back to me," she said against his lips. "Nothing could keep me away." She watched them ride out in the gray pre-dawn light, the cattle streaming behind them, the men's voices calling and guiding the herd. She stood on the porch long after they disappeared from view, until the sun was fully up and Mary came to ask about breakfast. The weeks that followed were lonely despite the work. Pete and the hands who'd stayed behind were respectful but distant, treating her with the careful courtesy reserved for the boss's wife. Mary was good company during the day, but she went home to her family in town each evening. The ranch house felt huge and empty without Lucas's presence, without his voice and his laugh and the warmth of him beside her at night. Josephine threw herself into projects to pass the time. She started a vegetable garden behind the house, breaking the stubborn ground and planting seeds that Sarah had given her. She reorganized the entire house, cleaning and rearranging, claiming the space as truly hers now that Mrs. Garrett was gone. She began a quilt, working on it by lamplight in the evenings, designing a pattern that incorporated pieces from her old Boston dresses and scraps of Lucas's worn shirts, literally weaving their two lives together. She also started riding further from the ranch, exploring the surrounding country with Pete's reluctant blessing. She discovered a creek lined with cottonwood trees about 3 miles north, a cool green haven that became her favorite spot. She'd bring a book and spend hours there, reading in the shade and watching the water flow over smooth rocks. It was there, 6 weeks after Lucas had left, that she had an unexpected encounter. She'd been reading for perhaps an hour when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see a rider emerging from the trees, a stranger on a painted horse. He pulled up when he saw her, touching his hat politely. "Madam, didn't mean to disturb you. That's all right." She stood, brushing off her skirt, assessing him quickly. He was young, probably about her age, with an honest face and a deputy star pinned to his vest. "I'm Deputy Will Carson, out of Abilene. Just riding the circuit, making sure everything's peaceful. You're from the Garrett Ranch." "I'm Josephine Garrett. It's my husband's ranch. Lucas Garrett." "Good man. Is he around?" "He's on the cattle drive. Won't be back for a few more weeks." The deputy nodded, his eyes scanning the area professionally. "Everything all right out here? No trouble?" "No trouble," she assured him. "Just enjoying the peace." They talked for a few minutes, the easy conversation of neighbors meeting by chance. Will mentioned there'd been some rustler activity further west, warned her to be careful about riding out alone. She thanked him for the warning and watched him ride off, feeling slightly unsettled. She'd felt safe on the ranch, protected by Pete and the hands, but the reminder that danger existed out here in the wild country made her more aware of her isolation. That night, she lay awake in the big empty bed, listening to every creak and settling noise the house made, missing Lucas with an ache that was almost physical. She pressed her face into his pillow, where the scent of him still lingered faintly, and tried to calculate how much longer until he'd be home. 2 more weeks, Pete told her the next morning. Maybe less if they made good time. But 3 days later, a rider came hard and fast into the ranch yard, shouting for Pete before he'd even dismounted. Josephine ran out of the house, her heart in her throat, knowing immediately that something was wrong. "Stampede," the rider gasped out. He was one of the men who'd gone on the drive, a young hand named Billy. "3 days ago, we lost about 100 head and 2 men got hurt. Mr. Garrett sent me back to let you know they're all right but delayed." "How hurt?" Josephine demanded. "Is Lucas all right?" "He's fine, madam." "Bruised up but fine. It's Sam who got it worst. Got his leg broken when his horse fell. They're camped about 80 miles north of here, near a place called Red Creek, waiting for Sam to be well enough to travel." "I'm going to them," Josephine said immediately. "Madam, the trail isn't safe for I'm going," she repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Pete, will you come with me? Or I'll go alone if I have to." Pete exchanged a look with Billy, then nodded slowly. "We'll go, but we leave at first light and we do this smart, not reckless." "Agreed. Agreed." She spent the rest of the day preparing, packing supplies, checking her horse's tack, trying not to think about all the things that could go wrong on an 80-mile ride through open country. Mary helped her pack food and medical supplies, her eyes wide with worry. "Are you sure about this, madam? It's awful dangerous." "I'm sure." Josephine tested the weight of her saddle bags. My husband is out there hurt. I need to be with him." They left in the cold pre-dawn darkness. Josephine riding the steady mare Lucas had taught her on, Pete on his big gelding, and Billy on his half-exhausted horse that he'd just ridden in on. The landscape looked different in the dim light, more threatening, every shadow potentially hiding danger. But as the sun rose and warmed the air, Josephine felt her confidence grow. She could do this. She was stronger now than the frightened girl who'd arrived from Boston 7 months ago. They rode steadily, stopping only to rest the horses and eat cold food from their packs. Pete was a man of few words, but his presence was reassuring, solid, and capable. Billy dozed in his saddle during the afternoon, exhausted from his own ride. As darkness fell, Pete found them a spot to camp in a hollow protected from the wind. They didn't risk a fire, not wanting to attract attention from any rustlers or drifters who might be in the area. Josephine lay on her bedroll looking up at the vast sweep of stars and thought about Lucas somewhere under this same sky, waiting. The second day was longer and harder. Her body ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, and she could feel blisters forming on her hands despite her gloves. But she pushed through, focusing on the rhythm of the ride, on the horizon ahead. Late in the afternoon of the second day, they crested a rise and saw the cattle camp spread out below them near a muddy creek. Josephine's heart leaped. Somewhere down there was Lucas. They rode in carefully, identifying themselves to the outrider who challenged them. Word spread quickly, and by the time they reached the center of camp, Lucas was striding toward them, his face a mixture of astonishment and concern. "Josephine, what the hell are you doing here?" She slid off her horse directly into his arms, not caring who was watching. "You got hurt. I came." He held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "I'm fine, it's just bruises. You shouldn't have risked." He pulled back to look at her properly, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop. "You were worried." "I was terrified," she admitted. "When Billy said there was a stampede, that men were hurt, I couldn't stand being back at the ranch waiting and wondering. I had to see for myself that you were all right." He kissed her then, hard and fierce, not caring about the whoops and cheers from the men around them. When he finally released her, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "You rode 80 miles to find me. I'd ride 800 if I had to. God, I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you so much, Josephine." "Show me where Sam is," she said, practical now that she'd seen Lucas was truly all right. "I brought medical supplies." Sam was laid up in one of the supply wagons, his broken leg splinted but clearly causing him significant pain. Josephine climbed in beside him, ignoring the stench and the discomfort, and set about checking his injury. She'd learned some basic doctoring from Margaret Sullivan during the winter, and she applied that knowledge now, rewrapping the splint more securely, dosing him with laudanum for the pain, making him as comfortable as possible. "Thank you, madam," Sam said, his voice weak. "Didn't expect to see you out here. Where else would I be?" She brushed his sweaty hair back from his forehead. "We're all family on this ranch. You do the same for me." That night she slept in Lucas's arms under the stars, wrapped in blankets near the fire. The men had given them a respectful distance, setting their own bedrolls on the far side of camp. The sounds of the herd settling for the night, the crackle of the fire, the vast silence of the plains around them, it all felt both strange and right. "I can't believe you're here," Lucas murmured against her hair. "When I saw you ride in, I thought I was hallucinating. I'm here, I'm real." She laced her fingers through his. "I know you said the trail was dangerous, but I'm your wife. Where you go, I go. That's what marriage means. Even when it means sleeping on the ground and eating trail dust. Even then." They stayed with the cattle camp for 3 more days, waiting for Sam to be strong enough to travel. Josephine made herself useful, cooking for the crew, tending to Sam, helping with the small tasks that made camp life more bearable. The men, initially awkward around their boss's wife, gradually relaxed, realizing she wasn't some delicate flower who would faint at rough language or hard work. On the fourth day, with Sam improving and the cattle rested, they began the slow journey back to the ranch. They traveled in stages, covering less ground per day than they normally would, careful not to jostle Sam too much. Josephine rode beside the wagon, talking to Sam to keep his spirits up, or next to Lucas at the front of the herd, learning more about cattle management than she'd ever thought she'd need to know. It took them nearly 2 weeks to make it home, twice as long as the drive north had taken. But finally, on a warm morning in mid-May, the ranch came into view. Josephine felt a surge of emotion seeing it. This place that had once seemed like a prison now looked like the most beautiful sight in the world. Home. They got Sam settled in the bunkhouse with instructions for his continued care. The rest of the hands dispersed to their various tasks, and finally, Lucas and Josephine were alone in the ranch house. She'd been wearing the same clothes for days, felt covered in dust and sweat, but before she could head for the washroom, Lucas caught her hand. "Wait, I need to say something." She turned to face him, seeing the serious expression on his face. "What is it? When I married you, I did it partly to save you from that contract. I told myself I was falling in love with you, and I was, but there was still a part of me that felt guilty. Like I'd pushed you into something you weren't ready for." He cupped her face gently. "But when you rode into that camp, when you came 80 miles through dangerous country just to make sure I was all right, I realized something. This isn't one-sided. You love me too. Really love me, not just gratitude or convenience, but real love." "Of course I love you," she said, tears pricking her eyes. "How could I not? You're brave and kind and good. You saved me, and then you spent every day proving that I was worth saving. You made me believe in myself again. You gave me a home and a life and a purpose. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone." He kissed her deeply, tenderly, pouring 7 years of emotion into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably get cleaned up," he said, his voice low and rough with want. "Probably," she agreed, then grinned. "Race you to the bath." They made love that afternoon with the sun streaming through the windows, relearning each other after weeks apart, no longer cautious or careful but passionate and certain. Afterward, lying tangled together in their bed, Josephine felt a sense of profound contentment. "I want to do this forever," she said drowsily. "You and me, building this life together." "Forever sounds about right," Lucas agreed. He kissed her shoulder. "What do you say we make it official? Have a proper celebration, invite the neighbors, really let everyone know that we're in this for the long haul." "We're already married," she pointed out, amused. "I know, but we rushed the first time. My mother wasn't there, which is probably for the best, but your friends were. I want to throw a party, show you off, let the whole county know how proud I am to be your husband." "That sounds wonderful," she said, her heart warming at the idea. "Let's do it. Let's have the biggest celebration this ranch has ever seen." They spent the next month preparing. Word went out to all the neighboring ranches, to everyone they knew in Abilene and beyond. Sarah, Emma, and Margaret threw themselves into helping with preparations, turning it into a full community effort. Tables were built, food prepared, decorations hung. Lucas even hired musicians from San Antonio, a 4-piece band that could play waltzes and reels. On a perfect June evening, with the sun setting gold and orange over the ranch, nearly 100 people gathered to celebrate Lucas and Josephine's marriage. She wore a new dress made by the best seamstress in Abilene, deep rose-colored silk that Emma had sworn made her look like a princess. Lucas wore a new suit and looked so handsome that Josephine's breath caught when she saw him. Reverend Walsh said a few words, blessing their union again, and then the party began in earnest. There was food and dancing and laughter, the kind of celebration that could be heard for miles across the quiet plains. Josephine danced with Lucas first, of course, a slow waltz that made her feel like she was floating. Then she danced with Pete, who was surprisingly graceful, and with Will Carson, the deputy who'd warned her about rustlers and had become a friend. As the night wore on and the stars came out, she found herself standing at the edge of the crowd with Lucas's arm around her waist, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said honestly. "When I got on that train in Boston, I thought my life was over. I thought I was going to spend 5 years as a servant and then die alone somewhere. I never imagined this, any of this." "I'm glad that contract found its way to me," Lucas said. "I'm glad you were brave enough to sign it, even though it was a lie, because it brought you here and you brought me back to life. I'd been sleepwalking since my father died, just going through the motions. Then you showed up, and suddenly everything mattered again." She turned in his arms to face him fully. "You burned the contract. You set me free, and then I chose you anyway. That's the best part of all of this. I'm here because I want to be, not because any paper says I have to be. I'm yours because I love you, not because I'm bound to you." "Dance with me again," he said, pulling her back toward the music. "Dance with me until dawn." She laughed and let him lead her into the dancing crowd, into the music and the celebration, into the life they were building together one day at a time. The summer passed in a golden haze of work and love and growing prosperity. The money from the cattle drive allowed them to expand their operation, to hire more hands, to build that new barn Lucas had wanted. Josephine continued to surprise herself with how much she loved ranch life, how satisfying it was to see the results of hard work in fattening cattle and growing gardens, and a well-run household. She also discovered she had a head for the business side of things. Lucas started including her in decisions about the ranch, valuing her opinion on everything from which bulls to buy to how to negotiate with buyers. They became true partners, complementing each other's strengths. In August, Sarah gave birth to her second child, a daughter, and Josephine spent several days at the Jenkins Ranch helping with the new baby and the energetic 2-year-old son. Holding the infant, feeling the warm weight of new life in her arms, she felt a longing she hadn't expected. That night back home, she broached the subject with Lucas as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "You want children?" she asked. He looked at her surprised. "I haven't really thought about it, do you?" "I think I do. Eventually. Not right away, maybe, but someday. I like the idea of a family, children running around this ranch, growing up wild and free and loved." "I like that idea too," he said slowly. "A son or daughter who could inherit all this, someone to pass the ranch down to. Or several someones," she said, grinning at him. "I was an only child. It was lonely. I'd want at least 2 or 3. 2 or 3, he repeated, then laughed. "All right then, we'd better get started." She swatted his arm playfully. But that night, they made love with new purpose, with the unspoken understanding that they were trying to create something beyond just themselves. Fall arrived with cooler temperatures and the busy work of preparing for winter. Josephine canned vegetables from her garden, preserved fruit from the small orchard behind the house, helped butcher a steer for their winter meat supply. She learned skills she'd never needed in Boston, discovering a competence in herself that she'd never known existed. In late September, she realized she'd missed her monthly courses. Then in October she missed them again, and the morning sickness started. Margaret Sullivan, with her medical training, confirmed what Josephine already suspected. She was pregnant. She told Lucas that evening, unable to wait for a perfect moment. He came in from checking on the horses, tired and dusty, and she just blurted it out. "I'm going to have a baby." He froze, staring at her. "You're what?" "A baby, our baby. In the spring," Margaret thinks. "Probably April or May." The joy that spread across his face was like watching the sun rise. He whooped, picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then set her down carefully as if she might break. "A baby," he kept saying. "We're going to have a baby. We are." She placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Are you happy?" "Happy. Josephine, I don't even have words. This is everything. You're giving me everything." That night they lay together in bed, his hand resting protectively on her belly, talking about the future in a new way. Names were discussed and discarded. Hopes and fears were shared. Plans were made for converting one of the spare rooms into a nursery. "Boy or girl, what do you hope for?" Josephine asked. "Healthy," Lucas said immediately. "That's all that matters. But if I'm being honest, I'd love a daughter who looks just like you, smart and strong and beautiful." "I was thinking a son," she admitted. "Someone who could learn the ranch from you, who could carry on what you're building here. We might get both eventually," he pointed out. "You said you wanted 2 or 3, remember?" "I remember." She kissed him softly. "Thank you for this, for all of it, for being the kind of man I want to raise children with." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Josephine continued working as much as she could, though Lucas fussed over her constantly, trying to stop her from lifting anything heavy or working too hard. She ignored most of his fretting, knowing that she needed to stay strong and active. Her friends rallied around her, throwing her a party in February where they gave her baby clothes and blankets and endless advice. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's mother, taught her how to make traditional remedies for teething and colic. Sarah shared war stories from her own pregnancies that were both terrifying and reassuring. Margaret gave her a thorough examination and pronounced everything perfect. "You're healthy and strong," Margaret told her. "You'll do just fine when the time comes. But make sure you send for me as soon as the labor starts. First babies can be unpredictable." As spring arrived and Josephine grew larger and more uncomfortable, Lucas became almost comically overprotective. He insisted she rest more, worried over every twinge or pain, and started sleeping lightly, jolting awake at her smallest movement. "I'm not made of glass," she told him one April afternoon when he'd stopped her from hanging laundry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my wife," he said stubbornly. "Not my baby. I'm allowed to worry." "You're allowed," she agreed, touching his face gently. "But try to remember that I'm tough. I rode 80 miles through dangerous country pregnant, remember? I didn't know it at the time, but I must have been already carrying this baby. We're both stronger than you think." The labor started on a mild evening in late April, just as the sun was setting. Josephine felt the first contraction while she was preparing supper, a tightening across her belly that made her pause and breathe deeply. She didn't say anything at first, not wanting to alarm Lucas prematurely, but when the second one came 20 minutes later, she knew it was time. "Lucas, you need to ride to town and get Margaret." He went white. "Now, is it are you? I'm fine. But the baby's coming. Go get Margaret and ask Mary to come stay with me until you get back." He practically ran out the door, shouting for Pete to saddle his fastest horse. Mary arrived within minutes, breathless and excited, and helped Josephine upstairs to the bedroom. The contractions were coming steadily now, not unbearably painful yet, but intense enough to demand her full attention. Margaret arrived 2 hours later with Lucas right behind her, carrying her medical bag and exuding calm competence. She examined Josephine, asked questions, and nodded approvingly. "You're doing great. It'll probably be a while yet, though. First babies take their time." She was right. The labor stretched through the night and into the next morning, long hours of increasing pain, punctuated by Margaret's encouragement and Mary's cool cloths on her forehead. Lucas stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, letting her squeeze until she thought she might break his bones, murmuring words of love and support. Finally, in the late morning light, after a final exhausting push, their baby entered the world with a strong, angry cry. Margaret worked quickly, cutting the cord, cleaning the infant, checking everything. "You have a son," she announced, placing the baby in Josephine's arms. "A healthy, beautiful boy." Josephine looked down at the tiny red face, at the eyes squinting against the light, at the small fists waving indignantly, and felt her heart crack open with love so fierce it was almost frightening. This was her son, hers and Lucas's, a whole new person who hadn't existed 9 months ago. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one, we've been waiting for you." Lucas leaned over them both, his face wet with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. "He's perfect. God, Josephine, he's perfect." They named him James Lucas Garrett after both their fathers. Jamie, they called him, and he became the absolute center of their world. Lucas proved to be a devoted father, taking turns walking with the baby when he fussed at night, changing diapers without complaint, sitting for hours just watching Jamie sleep. The ranch work continued. Of course, cattle don't stop needing care just because there's a new baby, but Lucas delegated more to Pete and the other hands, insisting on being home as much as possible. Josephine divided her time between caring for Jamie and gradually resuming her household duties, finding a new rhythm to life. Their friends visited regularly, bringing gifts and advice and helping hands. Sarah was particularly helpful, having recently been through the same experience. Emma brought traditional Mexican baby blessing gifts. Margaret checked on Jamie regularly, pronouncing him thriving. As summer arrived and Jamie grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, alert infant, Josephine sometimes found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her here. 2 years ago, she'd been desperate and alone in Boston, signing a contract she didn't understand out of sheer necessity. Now she was a wife, a mother, a rancher, surrounded by friends and family and love. One evening in July, she was sitting on the porch with Jamie in her arms while Lucas did paperwork nearby. The sun was setting in its usual spectacular fashion, painting the sky gold and pink and orange. The ranch spread out before them, prosperous and peaceful. "Do you ever think about that contract?" she asked Lucas suddenly. He looked up from his papers. "Sometimes." "Why?" "I was just thinking about how angry I was when I realized I'd been deceived, how trapped I felt. But if that contract had been honest, if I'd actually come here to marry some stranger Thornton had picked out, I never would have met you, never would have fallen in love with you. Everything good in my life now came from that terrible situation." "I prefer to think everything good came from what we chose to do in response to that situation," Lucas said. He came to sit beside her, putting his arm around both her and the baby. "We could have just honored the contract, let you work as a servant for 5 years and then leave. Instead, we chose each other. That's what makes the difference." "You chose me," she corrected. "You burned the contract, and you chose me back when you said yes to marriage, and you've kept choosing me every day since." He kissed her temple. "That's what love is, I think. Not just one big dramatic gesture, but 1,000 small choices to stay, to care, to build something together." Jamie made a small sound, and they both looked down at him. His eyes were drifting closed, lulled by the gentle rocking and the comfort of being held. "We made that," Josephine said softly, wonder in her voice. "That's the craziest part. We made a whole new person. And we'll probably make a few more if you still want that 2 or 3 you mentioned." She laughed quietly. "Eventually. Let me recover from this one first." The months rolled on, seasons changing as they always did. Jamie grew and thrived, learning to smile, then laugh, then sit up. The ranch prospered with good cattle prices and favorable weather. Lucas and Josephine's love deepened and matured, tested by the challenges of parenthood and ranch management, but never weakening. In the spring of 1881, when Jamie was almost a year old, they made good on their half-serious promise to visit Boston. It was a long journey by train, made longer by traveling with a baby, but Josephine wanted Lucas to see where she'd come from, and she wanted to introduce their son to the city where she'd been born. Boston looked smaller than she remembered, more crowded, dirtier. The boarding house where she'd lived was still there, though Mrs. Hargrove had passed away the previous winter. The streets were familiar but foreign, like visiting a place from a dream. "This was home," she told Lucas as they walked through the common, Jamie drowsing in her arms. "For my whole life this was all I knew. It seemed so big then, so full of possibilities. Now it feels cramped. Do you miss it?" he asked. "Sometimes I miss certain things. The theater, the libraries, the ocean, but I don't miss the person I was here. That scared, desperate girl who signed a fraudulent contract because she couldn't see any other option." She looked up at him. "I like who I am in Texas better. I like who we are together." They visited the places from her childhood, the school she'd attended, the church where her parents were buried, the shops where her mother had worked before the fever. Lucas listened to her stories, asked questions, held her hand as she grieved anew for what she'd lost. But after 2 weeks, they were both ready to go home. Boston had been important to show Lucas her past, but Texas held their future. As the train carried them west across the vast country, Josephine felt her spirits lifting with every mile. "Going home," she said to Jamie, who was watching the landscape fly past with wide eyes. "Back to the ranch where you can run and play and grow up free." Lucas smiled at her across the train car, understanding exactly what she meant. Texas wasn't where she'd been born, but it was where she'd been reborn, where she'd become herself. It was home in the truest sense. They arrived back at the ranch on a warm May evening to find Pete, and the hands had kept everything running smoothly in their absence. The house looked wonderful, the garden was thriving, the cattle were fat and healthy. That night, tucking Jamie into his cradle and crawling into bed beside Lucas, Josephine felt a sense of profound rightness. "I'm glad we went," she said, "but I'm gladder to be back. Me too." He pulled her close. "This is where we belong, all 3 of us." The years passed in a rhythm of work and love and family. In 1882, their second child was born, a daughter they named Alina after Josephine's mother. Ellie, as they called her, had her father's eyes and her mother's determination, screaming lustily from the moment she was born and rarely stopping. Jamie, now a toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything and getting underfoot constantly. Lucas built an addition onto the house, adding more bedrooms and a proper parlor, making space for their growing family. In 1884, another son arrived, William, who they called Billy. 3 children under 5 made the ranch house chaos, but it was joyful chaos. Josephine had helped now, Mary had stayed on and proved invaluable. And they'd hired another girl as well, but she still spent most of her time with her children, teaching them, playing with them, loving them fiercely. Lucas continued to be a devoted father and husband, somehow balancing the increasing demands of the ranch with his commitment to his family. He taught Jamie to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, lifted Ellie onto his shoulders to see the world from his height, rocked Billy to sleep when he was fussy. Their friends' families grew as well. Sarah and her husband had 4 children now. Emma had 3. Margaret had remarried, surprising everyone, to a widowed rancher named Tom Peterson, and was raising his 2 children along with helping deliver half the babies in the county. The little community they'd built supported each other through droughts and good years, sickness and health, births and deaths. When Pete finally retired in 1885, too old for ranch work, Lucas built him a small house on the property and made sure he wanted for nothing. When a fire destroyed Sarah's barn, everyone pitched in to rebuild it. When Emma's mother died, the whole community mourned through it all. Josephine and Lucas's love remained the foundation everything else was built on. They still made time for each other, still talked for hours after the children were asleep, still looked at each other across a crowded room and felt that spark of recognition and desire. On their 10th wedding anniversary in October 1888, they left the children with Mary and Sarah and rode out to that creek where Josephine had once read books alone. They spread a blanket under the cottonwood trees and shared a picnic lunch, just the 2 of them. 10 years, Josephine said wonderingly. It feels like yesterday and also like forever. I know what you mean. Lucas lay back on the blanket, pulling her down beside him. Everything before you seems dim, like it happened to someone else. My real life started the day you arrived. The day you burned that contract, she corrected. That's when everything changed. No, he said seriously. It changed when you said yes, when you chose to stay even though you were free to go. That's when I knew this was real, that we were going to make it. She kissed him, long and sweet, tasting love and contentment. We've made it pretty well, I think. 3 children, a prosperous ranch, more happiness than I knew existed in the world. Any regrets? None, not one single thing. She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. Do you? Only that I didn't meet you sooner. Think of all the years we could have had together if you'd come to Texas earlier. But then I would have been too young, and you would have been a different person, and it wouldn't have been the same, she pointed out. Everything happened exactly when and how it needed to for us to find each other. I believe that. They stayed there for hours, talking and making love and just being together. 2 people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from a beginning rooted in deception and desperation. As the afternoon light turned golden, they reluctantly packed up to head back. The children would be missing them, and there was always work to be done on a ranch. But riding back side by side, their horses moving in easy rhythm, Josephine felt completely at peace. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes but also continuity. Jamie grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved the ranch work and followed his father everywhere. Ellie was wild and fearless, climbing trees and riding horses, and befriending every animal on the ranch. Billy was the dreamer, more interested in books than cattle, and Josephine made sure he had plenty to read. In 1890, a 4th child surprised them, another daughter, Anne, who came into the world during a spectacular thunderstorm and seemed to carry that energy with her throughout her childhood. 4 children kept them busy and exhausted and happier than ever. Lucas's reputation as a fair, honest rancher grew over the years. He was elected to the local Cattlemen's Association, helped settle disputes between neighbors, mentored younger ranchers starting out. Josephine worked alongside him in all of it, her opinion valued and sought after by the community. They expanded the ranch gradually, buying adjacent parcels when they became available, until they had one of the largest spreads in the county. They could have afforded to hire managers and step back from the day-to-day work, but neither wanted that. The ranch was their life's work, something they'd built together, and they took pride in every aspect of it. In 1895, as Jamie approached his 16th birthday, Lucas began formally teaching him the business side of ranching. The boy was ready, mature beyond his years, with a natural head for numbers and management. Watching father and son work together, Josephine saw the future taking shape. The ranch would pass to the next generation eventually, carrying on what she and Lucas had built. That same year, they received an unexpected letter. It was from Mrs. Garrett, Lucas's mother, now living in San Antonio with her sister. She was ill, the letter said, and wanted to see her son and meet her grandchildren before she died. Lucas stared at the letter for a long time, his face unreadable. "I should go," he finally said. "She's still my mother." "We'll all go," Josephine said firmly. "If you're going to see her, we face it as a family." The trip to San Antonio was somber. Mrs. Garrett was indeed very ill, bedridden and frail, a shadow of the cold, imperious woman Josephine remembered. She wept when she saw Lucas, clinging to his hand and apologizing over and over for her hardness, for the years of distance between them. She looked at Josephine with tears streaming down her face. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything. I was so buried in my own grief and bitterness that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. Lucas found happiness, found love, and I tried to poison it out of spite. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry." "I forgive you," Josephine said, meaning it. The anger she'd once felt toward this woman had long since faded, replaced by pity and understanding. Grief did terrible things to people sometimes. "You can't change the past, but you can have the present. Let us share it with you for whatever time is left." They stayed in San Antonio for 2 weeks, visiting Mrs. Garrett daily, letting her get to know her grandchildren. She softened in their presence, became almost tender, showing glimpses of the woman she must have been before sorrow hardened her. She died peacefully in early November, and they buried her next to Lucas's father in the cemetery outside Abilene. "I'm glad we went," Lucas said at the funeral. "Glad she got to see that we were happy, that our family was thriving. Maybe it gave her some peace at the end." "I think it did," Josephine agreed, squeezing his hand. Life continued as it always does. The children grew older. Jamie turned 18 in 1896 and took on even more responsibility for the ranch. Ellie at 14 was already drawing attention from local boys, much to her father's consternation. Billy discovered a love of photography and began documenting ranch life with a camera Lucas bought him. Little Anne was 10, still wild and free, bringing home injured animals and declaring she wanted to be a veterinarian someday. Josephine, now 40 years old, felt the weight of time passing but also the satisfaction of a life well lived. Her hair had strands of gray now, and there were lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the Texas sun. But she felt beautiful because Lucas still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. One evening in the fall of 1898, they sat on the porch watching the sunset together, as they'd done thousands of times before. The children were inside doing homework and evening chores. The ranch was quiet and peaceful in the dusk light. 20 years, Lucas said suddenly. 20 years since I burned that contract and asked you to marry me. Best decision you ever made, Josephine teased. Best decision we both made, he corrected. He took her hand, turning it over to kiss her palm. I used to worry in those early days that you'd married me out of gratitude. That you'd wake up one morning and realize you'd settled for less than you deserved. Lucas Garrett, I have never settled for anything, she said firmly. I fought for this life. I chose it. I choose it every day. You're not less than I deserve. You're exactly what I deserve, because I'm smart enough to recognize a good man when I see one and stubborn enough to hold on to him. he laughed, pulling her close. "Stubborn is right. I love that about you. I love everything about you. Even when I argue with you about breeding stock, especially then. You're usually right anyway." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Finally, Josephine spoke again. "You remember what you said to me once? About love being 1,000 small choices, not just one big gesture." "I remember. You were right. Every morning I wake up next to you, every time I see you with our children, every time we disagree about something and then work it out together, those are all choices. Choices to stay, to love, to build. And I'd make every single one of them again." "So would I," Lucas said softly. 1,000 times over, I'd choose you." Inside, they heard Anne shriek with laughter at something Billy had said, followed by Jamie's deeper voice telling them both to settle down. Ellie's lighter voice joined in, teasing her brothers. The sounds of family, of home, of a life rich with love and connection. "We did good," Josephine said, listening to their children. "From that terrible beginning, we built something beautiful." "We did," Lucas agreed, "and we're not done yet. We've got years ahead of us still. More sunsets to watch, more memories to make." "More arguments about breeding stock?" she asked, grinning. "Definitely more of those." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling his arm come around her, solid and warm and safe. The girl who'd arrived in Texas 20 years ago, desperate and deceived and alone, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own strength, who'd built a family and a legacy, who'd chosen love even when it seemed impossible. The contract that had brought her here had been a lie promising marriage but delivering servitude. But from that lie had come the truest thing in her life. Lucas had burned the contract and freed her, and she'd chosen him anyway, and that choice had made all the difference. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars took full command of the heavens, Josephine and Lucas sat together on their porch, surrounded by the land they'd built their life on, listening to their children inside, content in the knowledge that the best decisions in life were often the ones you made with your heart instead of your head. The Wild West had been harsh and unforgiving, but it had also been the backdrop for their love story. A story that started with deception and desperation, but transformed into something real and lasting. A story that proved that sometimes the worst circumstances could lead to the best outcomes if you were brave enough to fight for what you wanted. And they had fought, every day, in ways both large and small. They'd fought for each other, for their family, for their dreams. They'd won more than they'd lost, and even the losses had taught them something valuable. As they finally stood to go inside to join their children for the evening, Lucas pulled Josephine back for one more kiss, sweet and slow and full of promise. "I love you," he said. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after." "Forever," she agreed, taking his hand and walking into their home, into their future, into the life they'd chosen together against all odds. The contract was long since ash, burned away that day in October 1878. But what had risen from those ashes was so much more valuable than any legal document could ever be. It was love, real and tested and true. It was family, growing and thriving. It was home, built stone by stone and choice by choice. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.